According to the new policy guidelines, same-gender marriage is a form of apostasy. It is grouped with such forms of apostasy as acting in opposition to the Church, following the teachings of apostate sects, and teaching false doctrine. Curiously, it is not categorized as a form of sexual sin. Again, we are faced with a definitional problem, where the new policy governs the marriage itself and not the underlying sexual relations that this form of marriage implies. Elder Christofferson states that same-gender marriage is a sin and will require discipline.
We regard same-sex marriage as a particularly grievous or significant, serious kind of sin that requires church discipline. It means the discipline is mandatory. It doesn't dictate outcomes, but it dictates that discipline is needed in those cases.
This means that a member can be tried for same-gender marriage as a form of apostasy, while not being tried for same-gender sexual relations as a form of sexual immorality. It is as if the Church is pretending that sexual relations is not part of the marriage, or that the sin of same-gender marriage transcends the sin of homosexual relations. Before this policy, the Church viewed homosexuality as a sexual sin. The sin is called sexual immorality and is normally grouped with other forms of sexual sin, such as adultery and incest. The Church's current position on same-sex attraction does not allow members to act upon their attractions. From a disciplinary perspective, the new policy presents a problem. Members involved in a same-gender marriage are presumably involved in sexual immorality as defined by the Church. After all, having sexual relations in any form of marriage is a primary reason for the marriage to begin with. With this new policy, there are two different forms of serious sin within the same relationship, with different definitions and different circumstances. This would require a presiding authority in a disciplinary council to judge each sin separately, with the possibility that the outcomes would be different. Of course, if one of the two sins is more serious than the other, that sin would take precedence over the other. In this case, the sin of same-sex marriage trumps the sexual sin of homosexuality, since all forms of apostasy require church discipline, while homosexuality does not. The Lord looks at this issue quite differently. He is not concerned with the marriage per se, but with the sexual sin behind the marriage. It is homosexuality itself that is the sin, whether there is a marriage attached to it or not. He made this point very clear to Moses. Same-gender relations are an abomination and are not to be tolerated. The Lord classified homosexuality as a sexual sin, grouping the sin with other forms of sexual sin, such as adultery and bestiality. The penalty for homosexual relations was severe. This commandment has never been rescinded and is enforced today. Elder Christofferson opines that the issue of same-gender marriage is a tender one, tugging at the heartstrings of members. The brethren themselves are sympathetic to these questions, as he puts it.
And these questions that have arisen, we're sympathetic to. They're difficult, they're sensitive, they tug at the heartstrings, and they're very real.
But this shouldn't be. According to the Lord, same-gender sexual relations are an abomination worthy of death. Furthermore, same-gender marriage is not the issue.